DW Africa Link.
How many times have you had a glass of water today? Once? Twice? Maybe you haven't even thought about it. It's just there, clean and available. But for millions across Africa, access to safe water is anything but guaranteed. On March 22nd, the world commemorated World Water Day, a reminder that water is not just a basic need, it's a lifeline. Yet across Africa, droughts, pollution, and poor infrastructure leave entire communities struggling for something as simple as a drink of clean water. So why is Africa still facing a water crisis in the 21st century? Let's get into it. Stay tuned. My name is Josey Mahachi. Welcome to Africa Link, the podcast that connects you to the stories that matter from Africa.
Africa Link, every weekday here on DW.
The African Youth Survey reveals that 40% of young Africans spend over a quarter of their income just to access water. This stark reality highlights both daily struggles and the deep gap in water infrastructure investment between Africa and the West. So what's being done to fix this? To explore these questions, I'm joined by Abdikadir Aden Hassan, a Kenyan environmentalist and dryland champion with over 18 years of experience in conservation, agroforestry, and climate action. Also with us is DW's correspondent Andrew Wasike, who's been reporting from the field on communities hit hardest by water scarcity. Hello, gentlemen, and welcome to the Africa Link podcast. Abdikadir, as someone who's been advocating about this issue for years, I will start with you. The African Youth Survey indicates that 40% of young Africans spend over a quarter of their income on clean water. What systemic issues have led to such a dire situation, and how does this financial burden impact the socio-economic development of African youth?
The first thing is infrastructure gaps. And when we look at Africa in general, there is a population increase. And the population increase, it means more water infrastructure, more facilities, and more connection of water. Secondly, the challenge that affects water in Africa is this issue of majority of the people depending on rainfall. So that means when it doesn't rain, they are nomadic kind of lifestyle that makes them migrate from one place to another. Even if you make infrastructure investment in one village, later on the same half of the village again will relocate to another place. That means they will require additional infrastructure, they will require additional water facilities. We look at the urbanization and population growth, whereby due to the effects of climate change, people are forced to migrate from the rural to urban setup. Now, because of that, urban population then increase. In most countries of Africa, an essential service provider in terms of water, they are privatized. Now, when it's privatized, it means they have to return back some revenue to the government. Because of that, the cost of water increases. Now, the question is, how many of these young people are employed? How many of them can afford these water facilities? And there is issue of an affordability again. There is things to do with the development partners investing a lot on software projects in town instead of hardware, because when it rains, we waste a lot of surface runoff water. We do not have enough dams for storage. Like last year in Kenya, we had the worst floods in the last 50 years history, and a lot of water has gone into waste, apart from it causing damage in people, human population, in infrastructure, but also a lot of water has gone into waste. We are not in a position to store that water, because when it comes to affordability, one, there should be element of availability of water, and then secondly, storage. Then when we store this water, is this water clean for human consumption, or is it not clean for human consumption? And then we look at unemployment in terms of young people. 80% of population in Africa, especially with the young people, they're unemployed. when we look at somebody being in a position to afford water storage tank, how many people are able to store this water? And majority of the young people, some of them do not even have food back at their home. And we're talking about water, which is an essential service.
Youths in Nigeria are also saying some of them, since they were born, they've never seen water from their tap sources, right? It's always they have to drill boreholes, and that's so expensive. What's the cause of that?
And it's leadership. Everything starts with leadership and ends with leadership. Sometimes people are divided into some communities, tribal groups coming together, forming a government for the sake of forming government. Now, everything starts with leadership. This means from the village level leadership all the way to the national level, whereby we have presidents, becoming heads of government, especially in Africa. When we have poor leadership at the top, which is again supplemented by corruption, by the end of the day, that money does not trickle down to the village to the young person back in the village, because we have allowed these leaders to incur very expensive election campaign. Because of this, they will not be able to provide the services, the manifestos they have promised people. But by the end of the day, they have to recover all the monies they have invested in their most expensive political campaigns.
And water is not one of the priorities when it comes to them, which is very sad, hey, Abdikadir.
Water is in the manifesto that they are going to provide.
Yeah, I know, but it never happens.
It never happens, because by the end of the day, when they get voted in and they are sure in the first 2-3 years or in the first term, I have to get back the money I've invested, $1 million or $2 million to make sure that I don't run bankrupt. So by the end of the day, the local villager, we call them wananchi, they get forgotten in the middle.
Right. Now, Andrew, let me come to you. How are young Africans reacting to the revelation that many actually spend a substantial portion of their income on clean water, including you, a young person also there in Kenya? Are there notable movements or advocacy efforts emerging to address this issue, rather in Nairobi or the rest of Kenya?
Thank you very much, Josey. Absolutely. The reaction has been one of anger and frustration, but also action. Young people across Africa and here in Kenya, where I am, are deeply aware of how much they're sacrificing just to secure basic human rights like clean water, which is not available to everyone. I was checking yesterday when I was preparing for this podcast on social media. There has been a surge of conversations around water justice, with hashtags like water for all and right to water trending in several countries, maybe just because of World Water Day. But we are also seeing the rise of youth-led movements and community organizations, especially in places like here in Kenya, where I am, Nigeria and South Africa. You know that South Africa, the southern part of Africa, has been having lots of water issues. So where young activists are demanding more accountability from their governments and pushing for investment in water infrastructure. So some groups are even, I've seen that some groups are even launching crowdfunding campaigns to fund boreholes and rainwater harvesting systems in rural areas, which is the same problem we have in Kenya. We don't, like Abdikadir said, we don't have such systems where we harness water, from natural water. So there's both outrage and a real push for solutions, Josey.
Right. Now, Andrew, still with you, speaking of these successful community-led initiatives, or rather innovations that you say are in place to try and improve access to clean water in specific regions, what lessons then can be learned from these successes?
Josey, I've been covering environment news for so many years for Deutsche Welle, and there are some really inspiring examples. One that I would say stands out is in Turkana County here in Kenya, where local youth groups have partnered with NGOs to install solar-powered boreholes. And I think this is also the same for Abdikadir's region in Garissa. These projects are providing clean water to thousands of families in areas that were previously completely cut off because maybe the government has not invested in infrastructure that can allow people to get this water. So what makes them successful is the community ownership. Remember, like Abdikadir said, leadership has been an issue where money, especially in Kenya, we are ranked as one of the most corrupt countries in this part of Africa. Money meant for water, for somebody to use in their household, or for somebody, be it a nomadic pastoralist, to ensure that the livestock that he keeps, you know, has got ample water. Somebody else will just take all that money and do other business with it. So that success story in Turkana and also in Garissa and across Kenya, locals are trained to manage and maintain these systems, ensuring they stay operational. And just to add to it, another example is in Uganda. I saw that there are young entrepreneurs who have developed affordable water filtration systems that are being distributed in informal settlements. This is coming from money that they get from NGOs, or they're just crowdfunding, because the government is not doing enough for them, Josey. They want to filter water and ensure that they have got access to water. And most of these initiatives are being done by only young people, Josey. So,
right.
yeah.
Coming back to you, Abdikadir, there is a significant disparity in water infrastructure investment between African nations and Western countries. What are the primary factors that are contributing to this gap, and how can African governments and private sectors rather collaborate to bridge it?
To begin with, is when you look at the Western countries, most of the essential services are provided by the private sector. And then as a result, the private sector will generate revenue and then pay tax back to the government. And then later on, by the end of the year, there are those tax refunds that the government does make. That means these companies make a lot of money, both from the government and from the public. But by the end of the day, this service is very affordable. But when you come to Africa, corruption, you have to bribe your way to get water. You have to bribe your way to get documents, legal documents. You have to bribe your way to get even infrastructure development. Because we've seen this issue to do with marginalization, whereby in most countries of Africa, there are regions that are developed more than the other regions. For example, if you go to South Africa, there are places that have modern schools, but at the same time, there are places that have no schools at all. The same as for Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and so on and so forth. So it means there is need for government to recognize public-private partnership. In Kenya, for the first time, and in East Africa right now, they are working on the concept on public-private partnership, so that the private partners are able to invest in development infrastructure, and then by the end of the day, they have, like government leases that infrastructure for a certain period of time. The private sector get back their money, and then they hand over the project to the government. In Kenya, that is one of the ways that road infrastructure has been able to expand. The same as going to be for water and health and so on and so forth. So there is need to recognize private sector. Secondly, when it comes to financial constraint, especially in Africa, there is no country in Africa that does not have debt. That both from IMF and the World Bank, because this money is free by the World Bank and by the IMF. These countries, they will borrow every day, day in, day out. So that means by the end of the day, they burden every person. So that means even for me, I'm burdened to an extent that my grandchild will have money to pay that they have not incurred. So this debt burden for things like essential things like water, human, basic needs like water, they're supposed to be exempted from some of the huge taxation that these countries are taxed, so that by the end of the day, nations are able to provide clean, and affordable water. But you see, when the governments are burdened, by the end of the day, they end up burdening the citizens. That means citizens will end up paying a lot of money.
But international bodies like the European Investment Bank have shown interest in funding African water projects such as the Ruzizi 3 hydropower plant, Abdikadir. However, conflicts obviously and political instability that you even mentioned earlier often hinder these initiatives. So then how can African nations create a more stable environment to attract and retain such crucial investments?
Africa is the next destination for investments globally. But the challenge we have
it's been the next destination for years, for decades. For 4 decades I've survived Abdikadir. It's been Africa is the next. When will it be Africa now is the destination?
But I think most of these Western countries is as much as they're going to come up with huge investment projects, they must stop conditioning African countries and African nations to some of their demands. Like, we are going to do water project for you, you have to give us land to do military base, you have to give us this, you have to give us this. So by the end of the day, most of these countries and African leaders, because we have seen in some countries in Central Africa, there's been young people, military taking over, because most of the European countries have been there for a very long time. But people are getting poorer day in, day out. But by the end of the day, when these people want to invest the Western money, they will come up with a lot of conditions, like, we're going to train your military, we're going to do this and this. As much as they want to invest in infrastructure, they're not interested with the stability of that nation. That means if they come to your country, invest that money, by the end of the day, conflict starts, guns start coming in. You have seen what's happening in DRC right now. That's not the kind of Africa we want. We have seen what has been happening in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger. Most of these Western countries have been investing a lot of money, a lot of military, technology. But by the end of the day, people living in villages are very poor to an extent that children do not even afford to go to school. We want this money to be unconditional grants, so that we must first look at, is this project going to cause instability in these nations? That kind of mentality, Western countries fighting over African countries, that has to reduce, because we're looking at Africa from a perspective whereby it also becomes a great contributor to the GDP globally.
Right. Now, Andrew, just coming to you now with all these investment opportunities, or rather other bodies saying they want to come and invest in Africa, that even Abdikadir has mentioned. Given these investment disparities highlighted in recent reports, how then are African governments responding?
Josey, we are seeing some movement, though it's slower than many would like. Some African governments are starting to prioritize water in their national development plans. So, for instance, here in Kenya, recently we announced an ambitious, very, very ambitious plan to expand our water storage and distribution systems, with a focus on public-private partnerships, because normally it was usually either, it was mostly private. Again, if you look at countries like Rwanda and Ghana, they are also making strides in the same area. There's also growing interest in collaborating with international donors, like Abdikadir said, and also development banks. We also have the AFDB. But the challenge remains in translating. People can talk all the time, but the big challenge remains in translating these big promises into action on the ground. Corruption, knowing how Africa is, corruption and bureaucracy will always often kind of slow down these efforts. And that's something that young people are increasingly calling out.
Yeah, right. Honestly, talking about that, Andrew, aspect that you've just touched on, even the African Development Bank estimates that $64 billion should be invested annually to meet the 2025 Africa Water Vision of water security for all. Yet current investments actually fall short. So where is all this money going? Even now, if they are meeting to say we need 64 billion, who is there to man and to see that this money is actually being used for water? Abdikadir.
The thing is, that money is there, but the challenge is governments will again direct that money for some other use, maybe to pay off debts. And it's because of this kind of the financial model that African governments are engaged in, especially with external investment. Is this financing model that the governments are using to attract investors, is it right? Because we expected tax exemption, especially for infrastructure in water, anything to do with water, pipes, the connection, the solar panels, and so on and so forth. It should be a declaration by all African head of states, whereby every water related issue is tax exempted. so that even if we bring an investor, by the end of the day, that money is totally used for the project. But an investor comes, 40% of that money goes back as tax, 10% goes to what they call community mobilization and address social issues, and then 50% goes to the project. By the end of the day, this project time elapses, the project is still stalled. And that is why you have so many stalled projects in Africa, especially by the Western countries. Because these governments, they are, again, tasked by IMF and World Bank to pay some kind of debt. So when you go and give them money for water, they end up paying the same debt with the money that you are giving them in another form.
Abdikadir, just as your parting statement, climate change poses additional threats to water security in Africa. Then how should African nations adapt their water management strategies to address the increasing frequency of droughts and floods? And what role can the youth play also in driving these initiatives?
And first thing is, African leaders, especially head of states, need to come together. And for example, last year we had floods in all over Africa. They're supposed to sit down and say, there. And then the still challenge we have in Africa is the population is 80%, but all governments, the 53, 54 countries, the governments are not ready to, engage young people, give them the opportunity in terms of leadership, in terms of ideas, and so on and so forth. So many of the young people have ventured into social ventures so that they're able, with their unique, innovative ideas, they're able to generate, funding on their own, so that they're able to address all problems at villages. Because if we do not give these young people the opportunity to bring up issues affecting them, then all governments will end up failing. And this issue of water and young people not accessing water, young people not accessing healthcare, basic healthcare, get accessing employment, accessing quality education, they end up coming back, because by the end of the day, we're addressing an issue affecting young people, but young people are not part of the discussion. So for me, my parting shot is, we have to engage the young people and let them be part of each and every discussion, each and every policy making, and each and every table they should be seated.
All right, thank you so much. And Andrew Wasike, your parting words on what lessons youth can actually learn from this, and also solutions rather to curb this water crisis in Africa.
I think that the lessons that the youth can learn from this is that they hold all the power right now. Those people who are in power, who are not young, do not understand that young people are lacking water, So I think my parting shot will be that the youth have got the power, and this is not just an environment issue. It is very political and could shape Africa's stability in the years to come. So let the youth rise up and demand for water. No one in this world right now should live without drinking water. Right now, every time I take a break, I am drinking water. There's somebody out there who does not have that
Privilege.
Comfort. Yes, privilege. Yeah. So let the youth rise up and take the power into their hands and have water, which is the source, the lifeline to everything, Josey.
Abdikadir Aden Hassan, a Kenyan environmentalist and dryland champion with over 18 years of experience in conservation, agroforestry, and climate action, and DW's correspondent Andrew Wasike, many thanks for joining us. Water is essential for life, and conserving it ensures availability for future generations. Despite financial challenges, Gabon exemplifies effective freshwater resource protection through robust conservation and sustainable development. And that's important because across Africa, over 400 million people lack access to safe water. Factors like climate change, induced water scarcity, pollution, poor management, urbanization, and population growth intensify the challenges. African governments can play a crucial role in protecting water resources by implementing policies and strategies that address the continent's water challenges. That's it for this edition of Africa Link. Remember, you are not just a listener, but a part of our community, and your engagement can shape the direction of our discussions. We value your insights and encourage you to share your thoughts with us. You can find all of the Africa Link podcast episodes on Spotify and Apple or wherever you get your podcasts from. This episode was co-produced and edited by Eddie Micah Jr. My name is Josephine Mahachi. Thanks for listening. Until the next one, it's bye for now.
DW